Please, stop crying. He must never wake up.
Vanessa.
Grant, you're awake?
Who is that baby?
It's just the maid's child.
Then why are you holding him in our bedroom at midnight?
I can explain.
Then explain why you look terrified. Because I think that baby is connected to my family.
Grant Whitfield had not slept in 14 days, though everyone in his house believed otherwise. He lay in the center of his enormous bed, his chest rising and falling in the slow, practiced rhythm of a man deep in dreamless rest, his eyes closed, his hands folded loosely across his stomach the way a doctor might arrange a patient for peace. But Grant was not resting. He was listening. He had trained himself over 2 long weeks to breathe like a sleeping man, while his mind stayed as sharp as the day he closed his first $100 million deal. He had built an empire out of knowing when people were lying to him. And now, at 52 years old, engaged to a woman he was supposed to marry in 3 weeks, he had a feeling in his gut that refused to let him rest. So he stopped pretending to sleep for Real and started pretending to sleep on purpose. Vanessa Cole believed the sleeping pills were working exactly as they should. She had watched him take them every night for the past 2 weeks, watched his eyelids grow heavy, watched him drift under within 20 minutes like clockwork. She had no reason to suspect that Grant had stopped swallowing them, tucking each tiny white pill beneath his tongue and spitting it into a tissue the moment she turned away. Tonight, like every night before it, she waited until his breathing settled into that familiar pattern, and then she rose from the bed as quietly as a woman who had done this many times before. Her bare feet found her heels by the door. She did not put them on inside the bedroom. She carried them into the hallway first, and only once she was far enough from the door did Grant hear the unmistakable click of them touching hardwood. He kept his eyes shut. He kept his breathing slow. Every muscle in his body wanted to sit up, wanted to follow her, wanted answers right there in the moment. But Grant Whitfield had not survived 3 decades of hostile takeovers and boardroom betrayals by moving before he had the full picture. So he lay still in the dark, listening to the fading rhythm of her footsteps growing distant down the hallway. And he counted the seconds the way a man counts his own heartbeat during a crisis, steady, deliberate, refusing to let panic take the wheel. Somewhere past the second turn in the hallway, near the study where he kept his late wife's old writing desk, he heard Vanessa's voice drop into a hushed, careful whisper, the kind reserved for conversations no one is ever supposed to overhear. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Grant strained to catch every word traveling down that long marble hallway, and what reached him was fragmented, but unmistakable. He heard her say the word wedding. He heard her say the word account. And then, clear enough that his heart went cold in his chest, he heard her say we need to move the money before the wedding, so there's nothing left for anyone to find. There was a pause after that, a stretch of silence so heavy it felt louder than her words, and then a soft laugh, the kind of laugh a person gives when they believe they have already won something. Grant lay there in the dark, his eyes still closed, his breathing still slow, a man pretending to sleep while the woman he was about to marry made plans that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with what she believed he would never live long enough, or wake up soon enough, to stop. So what does a man do when the woman he is about to marry does not know that he can hear every single word she says? What does he do when the choice in front of him is not between trust and suspicion, but between the life he thought he was building and the truth he was never supposed to find out this way? Grant did not move that night. He did not confront her. He simply lay in the darkness of his own bedroom, in his own home, beside a woman wearing his ring, and he began to understand that the most dangerous thing in his life was not a business rival or a hostile competitor. It was sleeping less than 3 feet away from him, believing he could not hear a single word. Morning came the way it always did in the Whitfield estate, with sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows and the quiet hum of a household running exactly the way Vanessa liked it. Grant sat at the breakfast table watching her sip her coffee, watching the practiced ease with which she smiled at him, and he found himself searching her face for some crack in the performance, some flicker of guilt from the night before. There was none. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, telling him how excited she was for the wedding, how she could not wait to finally be his wife, and Grant smiled back at her the way he had smiled at rivals across negotiating tables his entire career, warm on the surface, calculating underneath. He had learned long ago that the moment you let someone know you suspect them is the moment they stop making mistakes in front of you. To understand how Grant Whitfield ended up here, lying awake in his own bed at night just to survive his own engagement, you would have to go back 18 months to a charity gala held in a ballroom dripping with chandeliers and old money, the kind of event Grant usually avoided because he found most of the people in that world exhausting in their sameness. He had gone that night only because the event honored a children's hospital his late wife Rosalind had championed before her death, and standing near the auction table in a deep emerald dress was Vanessa Cole, laughing at something one of the board members said, her laugh cutting through the noise of the room in a way that made Grant look twice. She had approached him first, which he found refreshing at the time, telling him she admired the hospital wing named after his wife, and Grant, a man who had spent 3 years grieving in near total silence, found himself talking to a stranger for the first time in longer than he could remember. What Grant did not know that night, and would not know for a long time after, was that Vanessa Cole had done her research before that gala ever began. She knew exactly which board member to stand near, exactly which topic would soften a grieving billionaire's guard, exactly how long to wait before letting him find her rather than approaching him directly herself. Vanessa had built a life out of understanding what wealthy, wounded men wanted to hear, and Grant Whitfield, still raw from losing Rosalind, wanted very badly to believe that love could still find him twice. Within 6 months they were engaged. Within a year, Vanessa had moved into his estate, reorganized his household staff according to her own preferences, and begun making quiet decisions about his life that Grant, blinded by the comfort of no longer being alone, simply did not question. It was Marcus, Grant's only son, who first planted the seed of doubt, though at the time Grant had dismissed it as a grown man struggling to accept a woman filling the space his mother once occupied. Marcus had sat across from his father in the study one evening, arms crossed, jaw tight in that way he had inherited from Grant himself, and asked him plainly why Vanessa always seemed to know exactly how much money moved in and out of the estate accounts before Grant's own accountant did. Grant had brushed it off at the time, telling his son that Vanessa simply liked being involved, that there was nothing wrong with a fiancé taking interest in shared finances before a wedding. But the question had lodged itself somewhere in the back of Grant's mind, quiet and persistent, the way a splinter works its way deeper the longer it goes unaddressed. The household staff noticed things too, though none of them dared say anything directly to Grant. There was a housekeeper named Denise Whitaker, a quiet, steady woman in her 40s who had worked in the Whitfield estate for just over a year, raising her 8-month-old son Elijah largely within the walls of the staff quarters because she had no family nearby and no one else to help her. Denise kept to herself, worked longer hours than anyone else on staff, and had a gentleness with Grant that none of the newer employees seemed to possess, the kind of familiarity that comes from someone who remembers what a house felt like before it changed hands. Vanessa, for reasons no one on staff could quite explain, had taken an instant and unmistakable dislike to Denise, an irritation that seemed to sharpen every single time little Elijah's cries drifted down the hallway during one of her carefully planned dinner parties. Grant, for his part, had grown genuinely fond of Denise and the baby, more than he ever admitted out loud. There was something about the way Elijah's small hand curled around his finger during the rare moments Grant passed through the staff quarters that reminded him of holding Marcus for the first time, decades ago, back when his hands were rougher and his bank account was still empty. He found himself lingering near the kitchen some mornings just to hear Denise humming quietly to the baby while she worked, a small, unguarded moment of peace in a house that had grown increasingly tense since Vanessa's arrival. He never mentioned these visits to Vanessa. Some instinct, buried deep and unspoken, told him she would not react well to knowing how much comfort he found in a housekeeper's quiet corner of his own home. It was 3 nights after the whispered phone call in the hallway that Grant heard something that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about his engagement. He had continued his ritual of pretending to sleep, tucking each pill beneath his tongue, breathing slow, and even until Vanessa rose from the bed believing herself unwatched. This time her footsteps did not head toward the study. They moved instead toward the east wing, toward the staff quarters, toward the very hallway where Denise and Elijah slept. Grant lay in the dark, every nerve in his body suddenly awake despite his stillness, and strained to hear what business his fiancée could possibly have walking toward a sleeping housekeeper's door in the middle of the night, her voice low, urgent, and carrying just enough through the quiet house for 3 words to reach him clearly. They need gone. Grant lay frozen in the dark of his bedroom, those 2 words echoing louder in his mind than anything he had heard in 14 nights of careful listening. They need gone. Not fired. Not let go. Gone. Spoken with a coldness that made his stomach twist in a way no boardroom betrayal ever had. He thought of Elijah's small hand curling around his finger, of Denise humming softly while she folded laundry, and he understood in that moment that whatever Vanessa was planning had stopped being about money and had become something far more personal, far more dangerous. He wanted to rise from that bed and confront her right there in the hallway, but he forced himself to remain still, because a man who reveals his hand too early in a negotiation walks away with nothing, and Grant intended to walk away with everything, including the truth. The following morning, Grant found an excuse to visit his longtime attorney and closest confidant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Isabel Reyes who had handled his affairs for over 20 years and had never once given him a reason to doubt her loyalty. Isabel had known Rosalind. Isabel had watched Grant rebuild himself after her death. And Isabel, more than anyone else in his life, had quietly expressed her own reservations about Vanessa from the very first month, reservations Grant had dismissed at the time as professional caution rather than genuine concern. Sitting across from her now, Grant told her everything, the pills tucked beneath his tongue, the whispered phone call about moving money, the chilling words spoken outside Denise's door, and watched Isabel's expression shift from concern to something closer to alarm as the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape neither of them liked. Isabel did not waste time expressing sympathy, because she knew Grant well enough to understand that sympathy was not what he needed. What he needed was information, and she promised to quietly begin pulling financial records, transfer histories, anything that might explain what Vanessa meant by moving money before the wedding. She also urged him, gently but firmly, to consider Denise's safety as a priority separate from his own investigation, reminding him that whatever scheme Vanessa was running, an innocent woman and her infant son should not be left inside that house as collateral while Grant gathered his proof. Grant nodded slowly, already turning the problem over in his mind the way he once turned over failing companies before deciding whether to save them or let them go. Except this time the stakes were not measured in dollars, but in a child's safety. That same week, Marcus showed up at the estate unannounced, a rare occurrence given how strained things had become between father and son since Vanessa's arrival. He found Grant in the study, and without any preamble told him he had done some digging of his own into Vanessa Cole's past, uncovering a name that kept surfacing alongside hers in old business filings. A man named Roland Pierce, someone Marcus described as operating in the murky space between investment consultant and something considerably less legal. Grant listened carefully, feeling the last of his doubts about his son's suspicions dissolve completely, and for the first time in months, Father and son sat together not in tension, but in quiet, focused alliance. Both of them determined to understand exactly what Vanessa Cole had built her entire relationship with Grant around, and exactly how much danger that plan now posed to the people living under his roof. Isabel's search into the estate's financial records did not take long to bear fruit, and what she found made her call Grant directly rather than wait for their next scheduled meeting. Over the past 4 months, small transfers had been quietly moving out of a joint account Vanessa had convinced Grant to open shortly after their engagement. An account meant, she had told him at the time, to handle wedding expenses without bothering his main accountant with every florist invoice and catering deposit. The transfers were modest individually, never large enough to trigger alarm, but together they added up to nearly $2 million, funneled into a shell company registered under a name Isabel did not recognize at first glance. It was Marcus who recognized it instantly, because it was the same company he had already connected to Roland Pierce during his own investigation days earlier. Grant sat with that information for a long time before speaking, staring out the window of his study at the manicured lawn where Rosalind used to plant tulips every spring, a woman who had never once asked him for anything beyond his honesty. He thought about how easily Vanessa had convinced him to open that account, how naturally she had folded herself into every financial decision in his life within months of meeting her, and how he had mistaken her efficiency for devotion. Isabel, watching him carefully from across the desk, reminded him gently that understanding the scheme was only half the task ahead of them, because the more urgent matter remained Denise and her son, still living inside a house where Vanessa had already made her intentions toward them chillingly clear. Grant made the decision that evening, quietly, without informing Vanessa of anything out of the ordinary. He asked Isabel to arrange a private apartment across town, paid for entirely through a separate account Vanessa had no access to, and told her to move Denise and Elijah there within 48 hours under the explanation that the estate was undergoing renovations requiring staff relocation. Denise, when Isabel approached her personally rather than leaving the news to be delivered secondhand, broke down in quiet, exhausted tears, admitting she had sensed for weeks that something about Vanessa's coldness toward her and the baby went deeper than ordinary workplace tension, though she had no idea what it could possibly be rooted in. She asked no further questions, packed what little she owned, and left the estate 2 days later believing only that her employer was protecting her from an inconvenience, not yet understanding she was being protected from something considerably darker. With Denise and Elijah safely relocated, Grant returned to his nightly ritual with a steadier resolve, though the toll of 2 weeks without real sleep had begun etching itself into the tired lines around his eyes, lines Vanessa noticed one morning and attributed, with visible satisfaction, to the stress of wedding planning rather than anything closer to the truth. She had no idea that the man beside her every night was no longer simply listening for information, but actively building a case against her, piece by piece. With the help of an attorney she had always underestimated, and a son she had never managed to charm the way she had charmed his father. What Vanessa did not yet know was that her carefully constructed timeline, the wedding she had built her entire plan around, was about to collide head first with a truth even Grant himself was not fully prepared for. 10 days after Denise and Elijah left the estate, Vanessa's mood shifted in a way the household staff quietly noticed but dared not comment on. She had expected, according to a conversation Isabel later pieced together through a contact still loyal to Grant inside the house, that removing Denise would settle something once and for all, some loose thread she needed cut before the wedding. Instead, Vanessa grew more agitated, more short-tempered with the remaining staff, snapping at a gardener over nothing and dismissing a caterer's tasting appointment with a coldness that left the poor woman rattled. Grant watched all of this from a careful distance, saying nothing, doing nothing to indicate he noticed anything unusual, continuing his nightly performance of exhausted, medicated sleep, while Vanessa grew increasingly convinced that whatever problem Denise represented had simply walked out the door on her own. It was Marcus who finally pushed past the surface of the mystery, driven by an unease he could not quite name every time he thought about Denise Whitaker's face. He had met her only a handful of times over the past year, brief passing interactions in hallways and kitchens, yet something about her had always tugged at a memory he could not fully place until the night he sat alone in his apartment scrolling through old photographs from nearly 2 years earlier. He stopped on a photo from a friend's wedding, a night he barely remembered clearly because he had been drinking heavily after a difficult breakup. And there in the background of someone else's celebration stood a woman he now recognized unmistakably as Denise, younger, laughing, standing far closer to him in that photograph than two strangers ever would. Marcus sat with that photograph for nearly an hour before the full weight of what it might mean settled over him. He remembered fragments of that night now, disjointed and hazy, a conversation at the bar, a walk outside for air, a woman whose name he genuinely could not recall the next morning because he had never seen her again afterward. He counted backward on his fingers, comparing dates in his head, and felt something cold settle in his chest as the timeline lined up with Elijah's age far too precisely to dismiss as coincidence. He did not sleep that night either, staring at the ceiling of his apartment the same way his father stared at the ceiling of his own bedroom 3 miles away. Both men now carrying the weight of a truth neither had said aloud. Marcus did not confront Denise immediately, because a man does not walk up to a woman raising a child alone and accuse her of anything without proof beyond a blurry photograph and a timeline that fit only if he allowed himself to believe it. Instead, he called Isabel directly, asking her, without fully explaining why, whether she could quietly arrange a meeting between himself and Denise at the apartment where she now lived with Elijah. Isabel, sensing the tension in his voice but trusting him enough not to press for details over the phone, arranged it for 2 days later, telling only Grant that Marcus had a personal matter he needed to resolve, a phrase vague enough that Grant did not think to connect it to anything happening beneath his own roof. The apartment Isabel had arranged for Denise sat on the 3rd floor of a modest but comfortable building, nothing like the estate she had left behind, but clean and safe in a way that mattered far more to her than square footage ever could. When Marcus knocked on her door that afternoon, Denise opened it holding Elijah on her hip, and the moment her eyes met his, something passed across her face that she could not quite hide fast enough. A flicker of recognition mixed with something closer to dread. She had recognized him the very first day he stepped into the estate over a year earlier, though she had said nothing, hoping against reason that he would never make the connection she had spent months trying to prevent him from ever making. Marcus stood in her doorway for a long moment before speaking, his eyes moving from her face to the baby balanced on her hip, taking in the shape of Elijah's eyes, the particular curve of his small chin, details that struck him now with a force he had not braced himself for even after 2 sleepless nights of preparation. He asked, quietly, without accusation in his voice, whether they had met before, and Denise's silence stretched long enough to answer the question before she ever said a single word aloud. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying a secret alone for the better part of a year, and she told him the truth plainly, without softening it, because she had grown too tired to keep protecting him from a fact that was never hers alone to hide. Denise stepped back from the doorway and invited Marcus inside, setting Elijah down gently in a small playpen near the window before turning to face him fully for the first time since he had arrived. She told him about that night at the wedding 2 years earlier, how she had noticed him sitting alone at the bar looking as broken as she felt after ending a relationship of her own, how they had talked for hours about nothing important, how one night had become something neither of them planned for and both of them forgot by morning. She told him she had tried calling the number he gave her weeks later, only to find it disconnected, and how she had made the decision alone, in a small apartment with no family nearby, to keep the baby and figure out the rest as it came. She had taken the housekeeping position at his father's estate purely by chance, applying through an agency months before she ever learned whose house it was, and by the time she realized the connection, she had already grown too dependent on the steady income to walk away. Marcus listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together the way his father's always were during difficult conversations, a resemblance Denise had noticed from the very first week she worked in that house. When she finished speaking, he asked her why she had never told him directly once she recognized who he was, and Denise's answer came without hesitation, sharp with a year's worth of buried frustration. She told him she had been afraid, not of him specifically, but of what a wealthy family might do to a woman like her, who suddenly claimed their heir had fathered her child, afraid of lawyers, afraid of being painted as someone chasing money rather than someone simply trying to raise her son. She told him she had watched Vanessa's coldness toward her and Elijah grow sharper by the week and had wondered, quietly and with growing dread, whether Vanessa somehow already knew the truth before she herself had ever spoken it aloud to anyone. That single sentence landed on Marcus with the force of a second revelation stacked directly on top of the first, because if Vanessa already suspected the truth about Elijah's father, then her cold campaign to remove Denise from the estate was never about a housekeeper at all. It was about erasing a threat to whatever future she had planned for herself inside the Whitfield family. A threat that had nothing to do with stolen jewelry or workplace performance, and everything to do with a baby whose existence could reshape inheritance, reputation, and everything Vanessa believed she was quietly securing for herself before the wedding. Marcus sat down slowly across from Denise, looking at his son for the first time with the full understanding of who he was, and felt the shape of the entire scheme rearrange itself in his mind into something far more calculated and far more dangerous than either he or his father had yet realized. Marcus left Denise's apartment that evening carrying a weight he had not walked in with, the quiet, disorienting knowledge that he was a father, and the far heavier realization that his son had spent the last several months as an obstacle in someone else's calculated plan. He drove straight to his father's estate, arriving well past midnight, and found Grant still awake in his study despite the late hour, a habit that had become increasingly common since the nights had turned into something closer to surveillance than rest. Marcus told him everything, the photograph, the timeline, the confession, watching his father's face shift from confusion to disbelief to a slow, dawning grief that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with how much time had already been lost. Grant sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face, thinking of every dinner party where Elijah's cries had drawn Vanessa's visible irritation, every cold glance she had thrown toward Denise across a room, every whispered instruction to staff that had seemed, at the time, like nothing more than a difficult woman's impatience. None of it had been random. Vanessa had known, or at least suspected, exactly what Denise represented long before Grant or Marcus ever pieced it together themselves, and she had spent months quietly working to eliminate that threat before it could ever surface publicly and complicate whatever future she believed she was securing for herself. Grant felt something harden inside him that night, a resolve sharper than grief, sharper than betrayal, the particular fury of a man realizing his own grandson had been treated as an inconvenience to be managed and discarded. Isabel, called in once again despite the hour, listened to the full account with the focused calm of a woman who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of unraveling. She told Grant plainly that they now had more than suspicion, they had motive, and motive changed everything about how carefully they needed to move in the days remaining before the wedding. She reminded him that Vanessa still believed herself undetected, still believed the transfers were invisible and Denise's removal complete, and that this blindness was the only real advantage they had left. Grant nodded slowly, understanding now that whatever confrontation lay ahead could not happen quietly in a hallway at midnight. It would need witnesses, evidence, and a moment Vanessa could never talk her way out of in front of everyone who mattered. The wedding remained 11 days away, and Grant understood that every one of those days now carried the weight of a countdown toward a confrontation he could not afford to rush. Isabel spent the following week working quietly alongside a forensic accountant she trusted completely, tracing the shell company connected to Roland Pierce back through 3 separate accounts until the full shape of the scheme finally emerged with undeniable clarity. Roland Pierce was not simply a business associate of Vanessa's. He was her partner in every sense of the word, financially and romantically, a man she had been involved with for nearly 4 years, long before she ever stepped into that charity gala in her emerald dress. Together they had built a pattern of targeting recently widowed or divorced men of considerable wealth, men grieving and vulnerable in exactly the way Grant had been that night. Men who mistook loneliness answered for love found. The trust document Isabel eventually uncovered, buried in a folder Vanessa believed no one would think to search, revealed the true scope of what she had been planning all along. It was a transfer agreement, drafted weeks earlier, granting Roland's shell company controlling interest over a family trust originally established by Grant to protect his late wife's charitable foundation, the same foundation that funded the children's hospital wing bearing Rosalind's name. The signature at the bottom was Grant's, forged with a precision that spoke of practice, dated to take effect the week after the wedding, once Vanessa's position as his legal wife would make any dispute considerably harder to untangle in court. Grant stared at that forged signature for a long time, feeling something colder than anger settle over him, the particular violation of watching his dead wife's legacy nearly stolen out from under her own name. Marcus, meanwhile, had begun spending time with Denise and Elijah outside the shadow of secrecy that had defined their previous encounters, not as a couple rebuilding something romantic, but as 2 people learning, slowly and carefully, how to co-parent a child neither of them had planned for. Denise remained cautious, unwilling to trust too quickly given everything the Whitfield name had already cost her in fear and uncertainty, but she found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected, for how gently Marcus approached his son, holding him with the same careful tenderness Grant had once shown Elijah in the estate kitchen without anyone fully understanding why the old man's guard dropped so completely around that particular child. None of them yet knew that Grant's affection for Elijah, formed before he ever learned the truth of his blood, had been quietly preparing him all along for a bond deeper than mere kindness toward a housekeeper's son. With 5 days remaining before the wedding, Grant made the decision to stop pretending. Not publicly, not yet, but privately, with Isabel and Marcus. He began planning exactly how the truth would surface, choosing the rehearsal dinner as the moment rather than the wedding itself, reasoning that Vanessa deserved to face what she had done in front of the very family she had tried to manipulate, before she could ever stand at an altar and make vows she had never intended to honor. Isabel prepared the documentation meticulously, the forged trust agreement, the shell company records, a sworn account from the forensic accountant, everything arranged in a folder thick enough to end any argument Vanessa might attempt once the truth came into the open. Marcus, for his part, insisted on being the one to bring Denise and Elijah to the dinner himself, no longer willing to keep his son hidden away as though he were something to be ashamed of rather than someone to be claimed. Vanessa noticed nothing unusual in the days leading up to the rehearsal dinner, continuing to plan seating arrangements and flower selections with the same meticulous attention she had applied to every other detail of a wedding she believed was still entirely under her control. She mentioned to Grant one evening, almost offhandedly, how relieved she was that the awkwardness with the previous housekeeper had resolved itself so smoothly, and Grant, forcing his voice into the same warm, tired tone he had used for 2 weeks straight, told her he was glad it had all worked out for the best. She smiled at him across the dinner table, reaching for his hand the way she always did, and Grant let her take it. Thinking of the folder locked in Isabel's office, and the 5 days remaining before everything she believed about her own cleverness would collapse in front of every person she had ever tried to impress. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Grant sat alone in his study long after Vanessa had gone to bed, looking at an old photograph of Rosalind on his desk, the woman who had never once needed to manipulate him into loving her. He thought about how close he had come to marrying someone capable of erasing a child from existence to protect her own interests, and he thought about Elijah, asleep now in a modest apartment across town, unaware that his grandfather was hours away from finally standing up for him in the way he deserved. Grant closed the folder Isabel had left with him for review, turned off the desk lamp, and for the first time in over 2 weeks, allowed himself to actually sleep, knowing that come tomorrow evening, the performance would finally be over. The rehearsal dinner was held in the grand ballroom of the estate, the same room where Grant had once hosted countless business galas, now transformed with white orchids and candlelight for an occasion Vanessa had spent months perfecting down to the smallest detail. Family friends, board members, and a handful of relatives gathered at long tables draped in ivory linen, champagne flowing freely while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Vanessa moved through the room in a deep sapphire gown, greeting guests with the same practiced warmth she had used to win Grant's heart 18 months earlier, entirely unaware that the folder resting in Isabel's handbag across the room contained enough evidence to end everything she had built. Grant watched her from across the room, raising his glass when she caught his eye, playing the role of devoted fiancé one final time while Marcus stood near the entrance, waiting for the signal they had agreed upon the night before. The signal came just as the appetizers were being cleared, when Grant rose from his seat and asked quietly for everyone's attention, his voice carrying easily across the now hushed ballroom. He thanked everyone for coming, told them how much their presence meant to him, and then, without raising his voice, said he needed to share something important before the wedding could move forward. Vanessa's smile remained fixed in place, though something flickered behind her eyes as she watched Isabel step forward from the side of the room, folder in hand, and Marcus moved toward the entrance where Denise stood waiting, Elijah asleep against her shoulder. The room's easy chatter dissolved into confused silence, guests glancing between each other, sensing that whatever was about to happen had nothing to do with toasts or wedding traditions. Grant spoke plainly, without theatrics, describing the 2 weeks he had spent pretending to be medicated into sleep, the whispered phone call about moving money before the wedding, the chilling instruction to have Denise and her son removed from the estate entirely. He watched Vanessa's composure begin to crack as Isabel opened the folder and read aloud the details of the forged trust document. The shell company traced directly to Roland Pierce, the 4-year relationship Vanessa had maintained with him throughout her entire engagement to Grant. Gasps rippled through the ballroom, several guests rising from their seats, and Vanessa's carefully constructed calm finally shattered as she turned to Grant with wide, panicked eyes, insisting there had been some terrible misunderstanding, her voice climbing in pitch as the room's silence pressed in around her from every direction. Then Marcus stepped forward with Denise beside him, Elijah stirring gently against her shoulder, and told the room, in a voice steadier than he felt, that the child in her arms was his son, and that Vanessa had known this truth long before either he or his father had, using it as justification to try to erase a mother and baby from their lives entirely. The revelation landed harder than the financial fraud ever could, because it exposed not just greed, but a deliberate cruelty aimed at an innocent child, and Grant watched the last of the room's sympathy for Vanessa disappear entirely. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, board members who controlled contracts worth millions, family friends who had known Grant for decades, and understood in that instant that there was no version of tonight where she walked out with her reputation, her wedding, or her scheme still intact. Vanessa's composure gave way completely under the weight of every eye in that ballroom, her voice cracking as she attempted first to deny the accusations, then to reframe them, insisting that whatever arrangement existed with Roland Pierce had nothing to do with her feelings for Grant, that the transfer had simply been misunderstood paperwork rather than fraud. But Isabel, calm and unshaken, produced the forensic accountant's sworn statement along with bank records showing the 4-year pattern of transfers between Vanessa and Roland's accounts. Evidence detailed enough that no amount of reframing could survive it in front of a room full of witnesses who understood exactly what fraud looked like when it was laid out in black and white. Grant said nothing further, allowing the documents to speak in a way his own accusations never could, watching Vanessa's protests grow smaller and smaller until they dissolved into silence. Security, quietly instructed beforehand by Isabel, arrived at the edge of the ballroom not to remove Vanessa by force, but simply to ensure she left the estate that night rather than attempting to stay and continue arguing her case to guests who had already made up their minds. She gathered her things with shaking hands, her sapphire gown now feeling absurd against the wreckage of the evening. And as she passed Grant on her way toward the door, she stopped for one final moment, telling him quietly that she had, at some point, actually believed she could love him too, alongside everything else she had planned. Grant looked at her steadily and told her that real love did not require moving money before a wedding or trying to erase a child from existence, and that whatever she believed she felt had never once outweighed what she had been willing to destroy to get what she wanted. She left without another word, and the following morning brought formal charges from Isabel's office: fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, charges that would eventually extend to Roland Pierce as well once investigators traced the full scope of the scheme back through 3 other wealthy men who had crossed paths with Vanessa long before Grant ever had. In the weeks that followed, the estate settled into a quiet that felt different from the anxious silence of the previous year, a peace that came not from the absence of conflict, but from the absence of pretending. Marcus moved steadily closer to Denise and Elijah, not rushing anything neither of them was ready for, but showing up consistently in a way that slowly rebuilt the trust Denise had been afraid to offer anyone bearing the Whitfield name. Grant found himself spending afternoons at Denise's apartment, initially checking in out of a sense of responsibility, then simply because he genuinely wanted to be there, watching Elijah grow steadier on his feet with each visit, reaching for furniture, then for hands. Then finally, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that felt anything but ordinary to the people watching, taking his first real steps directly toward Denise's outstretched arms, while Marcus knelt beside her and Grant stood in the doorway with tears he did not bother hiding. That evening, sitting in his study with the same photograph of Rosalind still resting on his desk, Grant allowed himself to think, for the first time in a long while, that perhaps this was what she would have wanted for him after all, not a marriage built on calculation and concealment, but a family assembled unexpectedly out of honesty, grief, and the slow, patient work of choosing each other anyway. He had spent 2 weeks pretending to sleep in order to save himself from a woman who saw him only as an opportunity, and in doing so, he had uncovered a grandson he never knew existed, a truth his own son had been carrying alone, and a version of love that asked for nothing except the willingness to show up, again and again, for the people who actually deserved it. The wedding that never happened, Grant realized, had given him something infinitely more valuable than the one Vanessa had planned, a family built not on performance, but on truth finally allowed to breathe.